Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar, Protect Legacy Applications Without Touching Your Apps Using Okta and Palo Alto Networks. My name is Adrienne Jones, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar. Today, our hosts and presenters are Casey Cross from Palo Alto Networks and Daniel Liu from Okta. Casey is Palo Alto Networks Senior Product Marketing Manager and has over 10 years of experience at cybersecurity companies. Daniel is a Senior Product Marketing Manager at Okta and drives strategy, content, and tools for our SSO and Universal Directory programs. During the presentation, if you have any questions, feel free to submit them via the Q&A widget at the bottom. We'll be holding all questions until the end of the presentation, and we'll try to answer all questions. Finally, we'll be sending you a copy of the recording and slides within 24 hours, and those will be accessible with the same link you used today. And with that, I'll pass it over to Daniel. Daniel?
Hi, thank you, Adrienne. Can everyone hear me okay? All right. Thanks everybody for joining us today. This is Daniel speaking. Casey and I are super excited to be talking to everybody about how Palo Alto Networks and Okta can help protect your legacy applications without touching your apps. So let's just get started, jump right into it. Why is this important? It seems like every other day, we see new headlines with the latest security breach or hack. There's plenty of evidence that today's attackers are specifically going after credentials. 81% of breaches are directly related to weak or stolen credentials. 91% of phishing attacks target credentials, the majority of which don't use malware to exploit users. And users are not making it difficult for attackers either. 73% of passwords are duplicates. Because password management is hard. You know, we often take the easy way out rather than try to memorize multiple credentials. And the primary and easiest way for external threat actors to execute a credential-based attacks are through phishing and social engineering. Instead of using malware or exploits, they often literally ask us for our credentials, and users are falling for it. The other risk is through insider threats, which is when somebody inside, like an employee, misuses their privilege for malicious reasons. And although attackers and malicious insiders may not have all the credentials, once they have one and get access, they use privilege escalation to move laterally through the organization, repeating phishing and social engineering tactics if necessary to get what they're going after. This means that once an attacker gains access, they can find a way to any or all of your critical apps. This also means that hardening access to only critical apps is no longer enough. Even as orgs face external threats that we talked about, internal challenges are at play as well. The way people work has fundamentally changed. Cloud-based services providers have shifted where the critical data is located, and a mobile workforce has changed how the data is accessed. As a response to these shifts, regulatory bodies have created guidelines to reduce the risk of sensitive data being compromised. Yet users still expect the same ease of access to data wherever and however they need access, and expect tools to improve, not hinder, productivity. So not only do orgs have to protect against credential-based attacks, they have to do it in a way that supports normal business operations and satisfy regulatory conditions. Not entirely an easy feat. The best solution is through strong authentication to all apps and services everywhere. In order to prevent credential-based threats, a good, strong authentication solution must be A, secure, B, simple to use, and C, accessible to the entire organization. So, how does Okta's MFA and Palo Alto Network Next-Gen Firewall help you secure your environment, prevent credential abuse, and meet compliance? I'll pass it over to Casey, who can help answer this question.
Great. Thank you, Daniel. So we'll talk about how to prevent credential-based attacks with Okta and Palo Alto Networks. Daniel pointed out how important multi-factor authentication is and how it can solve so many security and compliance challenges and just make it really difficult for attackers to complete their attacks. So you'd think that multi-factor authentication would be a no-brainer. But alas, integrating multi-factor authentication into existing applications isn't always easy. I've worked in security for a long time, and I've talked to customers about a lot of issues, and usually when I'm telling them about something they need to do, they usually have an excuse. They say, oh, I don't need that, or I'm outsourcing this, or that's not a problem for me. And at trade shows and at meetings, when I brought up the question, can you integrate every single one of your apps today with multi-factor authentication? Across the board, every time customers say, no, it's not possible. That's because a lot of organizations, they have a lot of applications, some of them on-premise, some of them in the cloud, some of them support SAML for authentication, authorization, and auditing. Others apps integrate with LDAP, others, maybe networking devices, rely on Radius, and they also have some custom or legacy apps, or maybe some applications that were inherited through a merger that were developed eons ago, and they don't support any type of standards-based authentication at all, but they do house sensitive information. And so organizations have this, dirty little secret that they have all these apps that really don't integrate today well with multi-factor authentication unless they go into each and every single app and customize them to integrate with an identity management provider. And that can be a costly and time-consuming process. So before we discuss the integration between Okta and Palo Alto Networks, we will look at the anatomy of a typical credential-based attack. It can be broken down into roughly 3 different stages. First, a user is sent a phishing email that entices the user to click on the link, and typically, if the phishing email is a good one, it looks like a legitimate email, maybe with some sort of action that the user must take, maybe to open or view an important document. Everybody has received a phishing email. I know I've received phishing emails. Some of us have accidentally clicked on a phishing link. There's a lot of statistics, I think, about how often phishing campaigns are successful. The reality is users will eventually send out their credentials. And so the second step is the user clicks on the link, lands on a landing page with a login form, and then provides their username and password. At that point, the attacker has everything they need. So let's say that the attacker has gained access to the network, maybe through a VPN client using the stolen credentials. Maybe they've paid some cyber criminal on the dark web to get access to a compromised machine in their targeted network. In any case, once they're in the network, they can use those stolen credentials to move laterally and find the data or resources they're looking for. And typically, this access will go completely unnoticed from within the organization's network. This is one of the key reasons why modern network breaches are so hard to detect. And it allows sophisticated attackers to infiltrate organizations and dwell inside them for months or years without being detected. So now what you came to listen to, how Okta and Palo Alto Networks can help solve this problem. So we can stop credential-based attacks by delivering network-level multi-factor authentication enforcement. Our integration allows organizations to deploy multi-factor authentication without touching their apps because the firewall, rather than the application, integrates with the identity management provider like Okta. So we'll show you what happens when a user is trying to access an app, in this case, let's say the intellectual property app, using Palo Alto Networks and Okta. With our, let me progress this forward. With our multi-factor authentication enforcement, if you want to protect an application in your network, you simply set up a policy on your firewall to force users to authenticate via multi-factor authentication before they can access the application. And Vignesh on our side is going to give you a demo of this so you can see exactly how it looks like from a user's perspective. When a user attempts to access the application, the firewall presents a username and password page and then presents them with a second web page with a multi-factor authentication challenge. The MFA requirement could be a SMS message, a push notification to the Okta mobile client, a PIN code, or a voice call. And this information is relayed to the Okta Identity Cloud. At that point, Okta verifies the user's identity is correct, tells that to the firewall, and the firewall allows the user to access the application that has intellectual property. Now let's look at the alternative. An attacker has gained access to the network and has stolen credentials. So they try to access the intellectual property server. And so they provide the information. What happens is that our firewall, provides that multi-factor authentication challenge. The attacker is able to supply the correct username and password, but then when our firewall requests a second factor, such as an SMS message to a mobile device, that's where the attack fails, because the attacker doesn't have that information, because the attacker does not have the user's mobile device, so they don't get the right 6-digit code, so they're not able to log into the application. Okta confirms that the information is incorrect, tells it to the firewall blocks the connection. And what's kind of cool about this is that even if the attacker knew of a way to exploit the system or knew a secret way to escalate privileges once they logged in, the attacker will never be able to carry out this attack because the attacker cannot connect to the system at all. We have blocked the connection at the network level. So we can help block each step of a credential-based attack. We can, in the first part, and our story today is mostly around our ability to integrate with Okta for multi-factor authentication, but Palo Alto Networks also has the ability to prevent users from accessing phishing web pages. So we have our URL filtering service, which can block known phishing sites, and our Wildfire Threat Analysis service, which can integrate with our URL filtering service to classify links and files and emails. We can also, and this is pretty cool, when I first heard about it, I was very impressed. We can also monitor outbound access to websites and detect users trying to provide their corporate usernames and passwords to non-corporate websites, such as phishing sites. If we see a user attempting to provide their corporate credentials, we can block the connection or generate an alert. And then obviously, lastly, we can integrate with identity management providers like Okta to provide network-level multi-factor authentication. So in the end, there's no single silver bullet that's going to stop every single attack all the time, although we'd like to think so. We get as close as we possibly can, but what we've done is we've provided multiple layers of protection to make sure that every step of the way we're blocking the threat, and that makes it next to impossible for an attacker to successfully execute an attack. So now I'm going to turn it over to Vignesh, who will show you what this looks like in live action.
Thanks, Casey. Let me share my screen. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
All right, cool. Thank you. So right now I'm going to show you a demo where assume attacker has access to the corporate username password, and the attacker is in the internal network, wants to move laterally, right? So this is one of the machines where the attacker is trying to access one of the internal servers. So the moment the attacker clicks on this link that is being protected by the firewall, there is an authentication policy that says that to protect this particular internal server, right? So the firewall gives the end user the captive portal page to perform the login. Attacker has the username password. He enters the username password right now. The first factor completes successfully, right? Because that's the corporate username password, and it has been validated against the LDAP server. So the second factor now shows up where the attacker is being challenged to perform secondary authentication. He tries a push notification from an end user's perspective. The real employee's mobile rings up, and the Okta Verify says, "Do you want to approve some request?" Since the employee has never requested for anything, they're gonna deny the MFA request basically. So once that end user denies that request, the captive portal actually ends up failing. The firewall will fail the authentication. The attacker cannot move forward anymore. So let's see from a firewall's perspective how it looks, right? So I have logged into my firewall under monitor logs, authentication logs. You can see that there are two events that has been like flagged. One is for factor number 1 that was done against LDAP server. That authentication was successful. However, factor number 2 that was done against the vendor Okta, that particular multi-factor authentication failed. So this is how our firewall being in line will actually end up protecting a resource. So right now I've actually forwarded the logs from the firewall to something called as Panorama. Panorama ends up collecting these logs. It actually goes and does some correlation. The Panorama can actually find out based on several things, such as has an end device been compromised, has an end user account been compromised, has there been many second factor attempts failure in the from the end user's account, right? So the correlation happens through logs. It kind of finds out that the logs through the logs that several attempts have been made from an end user, and correlate and the end user's account has been compromised. We can find those details out. So not only that, the Panorama, we have something called as a log forwarding feature. Using the log forwarding feature, we can actually forward logs to any HTTP or HTTP API endpoints, right? So we have something called as MindMeld. MindMeld is actually listening to these logs, and it is right. Let's give it a minute. So MindMeld is actually listening to these logs, and it is actually going to find out the end user's user ID basically. So once the MindMeld finds out the end user ID, it is going to send those user ID back to Okta. So in Okta, we have something called as we have created a group called as a quarantine group. Let me just pull that out. So in the quarantine group, what is going to happen is that the quarantine group is going to get populated with the end user's user ID. So we will have an application, for example, that an end user, for example, there is a SaaS application, right? That particular application can have a policy that says that for users that are in quarantine group, they require multi-factor authentication for every sign-on. So it will actually force multi-factor authentication for quarantine users at all times, right? So such an integration exists, right? So basically a log gets forwarded from the firewall to Panorama. Panorama does correlation. Panorama sends the logs over to an API endpoint such as MindMeld. MindMeld grabs the user ID details and sends those details over to Okta, and Okta actually goes and puts the user into a quarantine group. So let me actually see what happened here. Just give me a minute. So I'll show you from an end user perspective how it will look if they are going to actually submit the authentication, but from an end user, if they have to allow the access to the internal server, how it will look, right? So let's say if it's a real user, he wants to approve the request, he presses approve, and what happens is that that particular event gets passed and it will allow the access to the internal web server basically. So that is how the whole flow works basically. All right, Casey.
Thank you, Vignesh. So that was a great demo, and I think what we'll do is talk a little bit about a case study. It's not looking very good on screen, but anyways. But one thing that was important to point out is what Vignesh was able to do is set up multi-factor authentication, and we have set that up in customer environments in hours. And if you guys have tried to roll out multi-factor authentication to every single application in your network, it could be a month-long, quarter-long, or a year-long journey, and you could turn that into hours through our multi-factor authentication integration with Okta. So I'm going to go through a brief case study, and then I also want to talk about one I just heard about yesterday. But there's a global entertainment company that has billions of dollars in revenue. Multi-factor authentication for them was a key component of the company's zero trust architecture. They're using Okta with Radius for today, to protect their VPN connections. So our Global Protect network security client, which provides multiple capabilities, including VPN connection access, they're integrating that today with Okta using Radius. They also have a integration or in the works to integrate with our multi-factor authentication. What they've done is we showed them actually in a pilot about a month ago the ability to integrate their apps with multi-factor authentication through our integration with Okta, and we were able to demo the whole thing, set the whole thing up from start to finish and show it working in 3 hours, and they were amazed, and so that's their next huge initiative. And they have found that working with Okta and Palo Alto Networks has enabled the security team to really think like and enable the business rather than slowing down the business. And so it's been very important to them. And the other case study I wanted to bring up, I was just talking to SE, who says that they have a call center customer with a very locked down environment where users have very controlled access to everything they do. And what they used to use proxy servers everywhere in the network to try to control what users were doing and where they were going. And they've moved over to multi-factor authentication integration with Okta, and now they can control all those users and even make sure that if a user tries to log into a supervisor's machine, they have to use MFA, and that's all because of this 8.0 integration. So let's talk about how you can prevent cyber attacks at every single stage in the attack lifecycle with Palo Alto Networks. So most breaches that you hear about in the news focus on the initial entry point, maybe a Apache Struts vulnerability or some sort of malware on some endpoint, but almost every attack requires multiple stages before you get to a large-scale breach, especially if it's a more advanced attack. And what Palo Alto Networks does is it can help stop every phase of an attack. So if you look at it, we have our next generation firewall that can provide access controls and application awareness and user awareness and content awareness. We have URL filtering, threat prevention, threat analysis, advanced endpoint protection with our Traps product, and many other services that can help prevent every single stage of an attack. And one that's near and dear to my heart is the Light Cyber Behavioral Analytics application, which I think is taking Palo Alto Networks to the next level by being able to see unusual activity in the network based on behavioral analytics and machine learning and looking at a lot of data over time to understand behavioral anomalies. We also have cloud-based security. We have our Aperture product that can help protect SaaS-based apps like Office 365 and Salesforce. And then as we talked about in this presentation, we can integrate with Okta both to prevent lateral movement in the network for advanced attacks, as well as I think now that more apps are cloud-based, you are seeing some attackers like shortcut this attack lifecycle and go directly to the apps that house the sensitive information. And with our integration with Okta, we can help prevent that access. How do we do it? Well, I'm going to go through a very brief description of our solution. If you look at our evolution of our product, we introduced the next-gen firewall a decade ago, and it married a best-of-breed platform which integrated application and user-aware next-generation firewall with threat prevention, threat analysis, and URL filtering. And then we have our Panorama centralized management solution, which provides a single pane of glass to manage all of these products. And then in our second phase of our evolution, we provided consistent security. So we looked at how users access data, where those users were, and we expanded our product line to include the Traps Advanced Endpoint Protection, which replaces traditional antivirus to prevent known and unknown threats, and we introduced Aperture, which protects access to third-party SaaS applications. And then, as part of our third evolution, we are disrupting how organizations adopt and manage security with our application framework. So instead of requiring organizations to purchase, deploy, and manage every new technology separately, Palo Alto Networks has created our logging service and is moving log collection to the cloud for secure storage and advanced analysis. And then on top of this application framework, we are allowing our technology, we're allowing customers and partners to write applications for this application framework. And we're even letting competitors, we're letting our technology partners, we're letting channel partners, we're letting everyone write apps. We also have our own apps that will be running on the application framework. Some of the first one will be the behavioral analytics app, and then we will also support some of our other apps like WildFire will natively be built on top of this infrastructure. And we believe this is a better way to consume the most innovative security technologies from any provider. So maybe in a decade from now, when you're talking about security, you'll be saying, oh yeah, I remember back when we used to have 20 or 30 different products in our network, and half of them we didn't, generate alerts we didn't look at, and they were all from different vendors, and they didn't talk to each other, and it was a horrible mess. And then we started using the application framework, and now everything is centralized and consolidated, and it's much more efficient, and it produces better security outcomes. So you can think back when you tell those stories that you first heard about it here on this Okta and Palo Alto Networks webinar. So now I'll turn it over to Daniel to talk about secure authentication with authentication.
Yep. Thank you, Casey. That's great. Really love that story. Really happy to see this really play out, and that demo was amazing. So now that we know how critical a strong MFA solution can be when combined with a strong firewall, let's dig into a little bit deeper details into what a strong MFA solution actually looks like. The first is the secure authentication with MFA. So what secure authentication means is protection across all vectors and user groups. This is very similar to what we've been talking about this entire webinar. You're trying to get MFA across everything, not just on certain apps or certain parts of your environment. So in heavy on-prem deployments, much of your critical information is stored in one place typically, which is within the company's local network, often protected by something like Palo Alto Networks. As you begin to adopt cloud services, more of your sensitive data is no longer on-premise. It's controlled by you. So instead, it's trusted to your partners and service providers in the cloud, like in Office 365, Salesforce, or Workday. And of course, organizations are expanding. The groups of people that need access to the data is also increasing. And users are starting to work from remote locations, and they're using their own personal mobile devices, which introduces yet another environment and method of access that must be secure. And these different user groups are no longer just internal employees, but instead partners, outside contractors, temp suppliers. And their relationship to the company is a little more complex. Churn and turnover is likely with these end users, and so ensuring the right level of access with them and making sure that they get the apps and the access that they need to do their job, but also revoking that access when the relationship changes, that's important as well. And so a strong MFA authentication, MFA with strong authentication means securing authentication and accessing across all environments and user groups. To facilitate this, MFA solution must provide a way to verify that any user, whether that be a full-time employee or a temp contractor, is who they say they are. So organizations must also balance security with usability, of course. Can't just be very secure but difficult to use. And so proving your identity involves typically 3 parts. 1, something you know. 2, something you have. And 3, something you are. A secure MFA solution provides factors that fall into each of these categories, but allowing organizations to choose which ones fit their specific scenarios is very important. So for example, some factors like passwords and security questions are inherently low assurance factors. But since they're cheap and don't require additional equipment, they can be good for low risk situations or for access to data that isn't very sensitive. Towards the middle of the insurance spectrum, factors like SMS and software OTP provide an additional level of security by adding the quote-unquote something you have case. Plus, the prevalence of users with mobile devices has driven down the cost of using these factors. So in situations where step-off authentication is required beyond passwords, these are a really good option. As we move down the high assurance end, factors become inherently more secure. So for example, tokens and OTP are crypto-based, and biometrics are more quote-unquote phish-proof. These factors may be more expensive, both in terms of literal cost to deploy a physical equipment, but also in terms of usability, as they require more user interaction and might confuse certain users in terms of how they are skillfully executed. But in the end, a full range of factors and assurances provide organizations with the options to choose different factors for different scenarios. It also ensures organizations can comply with regulations or other external requirements. At the same time, we must acknowledge and plan for the fact that risk levels fluctuate for a variety of reasons. So for example, users are constantly changing location and accessing different resources. Changing situations may mean you might want additional assurances that user is who they say they are, especially when the activity may not conform to their normal routines. So is the user behaving in an insecure way? Maybe. Are they using weak passwords? Or maybe a password that they're using has been previously compromised in a breach somewhere. Are they acting suspiciously, like trying to hide where they're coming from, maybe through a proxy or use of a Tor network? Are they coming from suspicious locations where the company doesn't operate? An MFA solution needs to look at the user and the device context and be able to dynamically apply and modify policies to fit changing situations. This not only makes it more secure, but also creates a better end user experience since users only need to be prompted for MFA in certain predefined situations. Second part of a great MFA solution is that it's easy to use. So shifting to the usability side, let's talk about what happens when a user is challenged for MFA. This is important because, again, usability increases both adoption and overall security. We've already touched upon how flexible factors can be in terms of reducing the burden on the end user by asking for these low-cost ways for users to provide identity assurance. Another key piece of the equation is the policy that determines how to apply those factors under which situation to which group of users within your organization. So a strong authentication solution gives your admins granular policies for challenges based on the user's role. So questions like, are they part of a group that has direct access to sensitive information? If so, let's bump up that MFA policy so it's a bit stricter. As time goes on and insurance level decreases, how often should they be prompted for step-up authentication? Every hour, every day, every week? That's something that you have to decide as an admin to really determine what level of security you guys want. What factors can they use? We just talked about all the various factors that a admin can think about. So less costly and lower assurance, like passwords, do they fit your needs? Or must you go into some of the higher assurance factors that we talked about, like biometrics? A little harder to fish. But by offering granular and flexible policies, strong authentication solutions reduce the burden on the end user, increase adoption, and thereby improving the overall security of the organization. All very important aspects. And of course, when we're talking about simplicity and usability, we don't want to forget about IT and admins who are in charge of deploying and managing the solution. MFA solutions must be conducive to normal business operations. This means that MFA must be capable of integrating with the apps and services organizations are already using and be flexible enough to support custom scenarios. Better yet, this is an accomplishment that can be done without creating additional work for IT and provide quick time to value. And finally, the third part of a great MFA solution is its extensibility. With identity as a modern perimeter, MFA and authentication play a pivotal role in the organization in connecting applications and providing visibility. Let's look at this in stages. First role for MFA, along with other identity management tools, is to provide secure authentication, which we've discussed this in previous slides and previous builds. Next is to enable your business by connecting to all apps that are needed. Typically SaaS apps, cloud apps, but also on-prem apps as well. Finally, an ideal MFA solution extends to other areas of the organization. With identity as a modern perimeter, MFA and authentication play a pivotal role in making sure that you have visibility in all risk areas from your network side. We also plug into popular SIMs, as well as your mobile side. This allows the security team to connect the dots between different systems like Okta and Palo Alto, along with all the others that we've talked about. This is when you can truly obtain an end-to-end visibility into attack, from who is behind it or whose credentials were potentially compromised, to the attack progressing through the network. Ultimately, this will inform how to take action through responses like denying a user access to certain services, certain apps. And Vignesh touched on this earlier, but this is a great example of this in action is Okta's integration with MyMeld. Again, this is an open source threat intelligence syndication app. It was developed by Palo Alto Networks. And this integration can provide great context of a user's account status. So let's just quickly go through how this works again. Vignesh talked about it, and it was a great demo, but let's just remind everybody. So for example, let's say a user logs into a cloud app via Okta. Then the user performs unauthorized activity in the network, indicating that the user or device has been compromised. So the firewall just blocks the device, but it can't prevent the user from accessing the cloud app from another device on the internet. So the firewall automatically sends a log message to Okta using MyMeld to normalize the communication. Okta takes that information from MyMeld, realizes there's some unauthorized activity, and so requires step-up authentication before allowing the user to access corporate information. Oops. This is a unique integration that was announced at Octane, our user conference that happened a couple weeks ago. It allows customers to automatically update identity management controls based on intelligence from their firewall. All pretty cool stuff. So just to summarize, Okta and Palo Alto Networks are very excited about this partnership, especially with this integration with our MFA. Ultimately, what we provide is easy MFA deployments. So you can easily deploy multi-factor across your organization without updating your applications. We also support a wide range of authentication methods, including OTP, SMS, voice, Okta Verify with push, all the factors that we discussed in previous slides. And again, depending on your specific use case and your needs, you'll have to think through what makes most sense from a usability standpoint. And we enforce multi-factor authentication to critical systems such as SCADA and mainframe servers. So again, beyond just cloud apps, we do a lot more MFA now that you can do MFA to everything with our joint partnership. And finally, this is a great way to manage your compliance needs and your auditing needs. So addressing PCI and HIPAA requirements for certain customers are very important and do require MFA. So that's something that we provide easily now with this partnership. So that's the end of our presentation. For more information, definitely check out our website, okta.com. You can also go to the Palo Alto Networks website, or of course, contact any of us. The contact information for Casey and myself will be provided later on. And with that, I'm going to pass it over. I think, Adrian, we're going to take a look at some questions. Does anybody have some Q&A? Feel free to type that into the Q&A box, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. And if we don't get to them, we'll definitely follow up with you after the webinar.
Thanks, Daniel. Yeah, there are several questions here that I'll put out there for you, and I'll hand this over to you initially here to answer, and then if you want to get additional color from the other speakers, that would be great. So the first question we have here is, which factors do Okta MFA support? Which should I use?
Oh yeah, I could take that. Yeah, that's a good one. That talks to let's go back to this slide here. So Okta supports we support a large variety of factors, and these are all the factors that we support, from again the most basic of passwords and security questions, all the way to our integration with Apple and Windows to allow things like biometrics. So it really depends, again, on the need and the level of your security. We typically have most of our customers on our Okta Verify push solution, which is what Vignesh had demoed earlier on. If you had seen that, it's basically when a user gets prompted on their existing mobile device to accept or deny a multi-factor step-up authentication request. But again, it depends on whether your organization has a lot of mobile phones or if there are any other security features or difficulties that you need to manage around. Great question.
Great, thank you. Next question. Is Okta Palo Alto integration a separately charged feature? We're currently using it for VPN access and working towards integrating it with other apps.
Yeah, I can take that as well. Sorry, Casey, go ahead. I thought.
Okay, so there is no additional charge for that from the Palo Alto Networks side. So they get the MFA network level MFA enforcement for free as part of their next generation firewall.
Yeah, and I'll quickly add on to that on the Okta side. If you already have our MFA product, this integration already exists. It's free in the regard that it's included in your MFA. So if you're already using MFA to connect to Palo Alto VPN, you can use this now to connect to everything else through Palo Alto.
Great. Next question. Was there any additional licenses on the firewall required for the entertainment company case study?
And that's sort of the same question, and the answer is no, there's no additional licenses. You depend upon how your network's configured. If you don't have intranet firewalls between different segments and there's no way to control access between users and the server, you might need new firewalls. But generally speaking, if you have a way to segment a firewall or if you have internal firewalls, then there's no additional cost required to deploy this.
Great, thank you. How about, can I buy MFA on its own without SSO?
Yeah, I could take that. Definitely. Our MFA product can be bought standalone. Typically, our customers will buy it in combination with our other products like single sign-on. But if you have an existing IDP that you want to integrate with and you want our MFA to integrate with, you can purchase our MFA solution on its own.
Great. I have another question here. What if a user does not have Global Protect and they try to access a thick client app that requires multi-factor authentication?
So in those cases, and I'm not sure if we made this clear, but one thing that's very awesome about our integration is that we not only enforce multi-factor authentication to web-based apps, but we also can set up rules on our firewall that says if you're connecting through a different port 22, port 21, whatever the case may be, that you're going to require that multi-factor authentication. However, when that client is trying to access the app, they're not going to get the redirect that they would normally get if they're accessing a web application. So instead, our Global Protect network security client, which performs a bunch of different functions, protect the endpoint, it can also display a little window that says this application that you're trying to access requires multi-factor authentication. Click on this link to access the application. Now, if you do not have the Global Protect VPN client or network security client on the endpoint, then you just need to train your users to bookmark the authentication portal web page before they access the app. So they need to just know that if they want to access that particular application that requires MFA, they need to first log in through our two-step process.
Great, thank you. The next question I have here is what version of the firewall is required to use these features?
So it is available, the new multi-factor authentication enforcement feature is available in PAN-OS 8.0 and greater.
All right, let's see, next question here. Does this require a firewall between the internal server and the end user network?
And that one...
yeah, go ahead, Casey. Go ahead.
Yeah, that one is, there will be some need to have some sort of access control, so a firewall between the users and the server. And you can, there's some flexibility about where that firewall is installed and how your network's configured, but yes, you would need to have some way to limit access from users to the server through the firewall.
Great. Daniel, did you want to add to that at all?
No, that's perfect. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, we are at the end of our time, so I would like to thank everybody for joining us. We will, as I said earlier, be sending out the link so you can view the recording. It will be the same as you've used here, but we will send you a notification that it is available. So thank you, everybody, for being on the call, and we hope to see you on an upcoming webinar soon.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.